The story of Mercy Harrow does not begin with laughter, nor with a warm embrace. It begins in silence, an unsettling, suffocating silence that lingers over a small, forgotten town, the kind of place where the world beyond its borders seemed distant and unreachable. The year was 1892. The world was busy with its newfound machines, its inventions and discoveries. Yet none of that progress reached the dirt paths and leaning wooden houses where Mercy lived. For her, there was no excitement of schooling, no dreams of the future, only survival. The Harrow family was poor. Poverty in those days was not just a lack of money, it was a constant hunger, an ache in the bones, and an unspoken fear of tomorrow. Her parents, worn down by years of labor and hardship, saw in Mercy not just a daughter, but a way out. A girl child, after all, was a burden. Feeding her, clothing her, protecting her, all of it was too heavy a responsibility for a family already crumbling under its own weight. Mercy, however, did not yet understand this. She was 12, her world still filled with the little joys of innocence. She loved the stream that wound its way just beyond the fields, where she would pick wildflowers and watch them float away on the water. She had a doll, worn and patched, that she carried wherever she went. And in her heart, though she never dared speak it aloud, she dreamed of sitting in a classroom, pencil in hand, learning letters like other children she sometimes glimpsed in the distance. But dreams do not stand long against the weight of reality. Inside dimly lit rooms, whispers began. Her parents spoke in hushed tones with men whose eyes weighed not her spirit, but her usefulness. Marriage was discussed not as a celebration, but as a transaction. Mercy did not know. She laughed. She played, she sang to herself as the world around her silently prepared to strip away her childhood. The tragedy of Mercy Harrow was not sudden. It did not crash upon her like a wave. It crept slowly like a shadow, beginning with whispers that grew into conversations that became decisions. She did not hear the gavel fall, but her fate was already sealed. The story of Mercy Harrow begins here, in the silence, in the whispers, in the moment a child's laughter began to fade into something darker. The morning of her wedding arrived without warning, and without the joy that usually surrounds such an event. Mercy woke to her mother's voice telling her to wear her best dress, a pale blue fabric stitched from scraps. She thought perhaps it was a festival, or maybe a Sunday gathering. She smiled faintly, excited for something different, unaware that this day would mark the end of her childhood. The church stood at the center of the town, its wooden frame weathered, its bell silent. Inside, whispers filled the air as curious eyes turned to the girl walking through its doors. Mercy held tightly to her mother's hand, her small palm trembling. She was too young to understand the weight of the gazes upon her, too young to realize that every step toward the altar was a step away from her freedom. The man who stood waiting for her was much older, his face lined, his eyes heavy with ownership rather than affection. To the townsfolk, he was suitable. He had land, he had strength, he had survival. To Mercy, he was a stranger, his presence frightening and suffocating. There were no flowers adorning the pews, no music filling the air, no laughter. This was not a celebration, it was an exchange. Her parents stood silent, their faces stiff, convinced that this was the only way forward. They told themselves she would be cared for, that she would not starve, that her life in some way might be easier. They did not see the fear in her eyes, or perhaps they chose not to. The vows were spoken, but the words meant nothing to Mercy. She repeated them softly, uncertain, her voice barely audible. A ring, far too large for her tiny finger, was slipped on. Applause murmured through the church, approval whispered among the crowd. But inside her, there was no joy. There was only confusion, fear, and a silent cry she could not voice. The church doors closed behind her, and the world shifted. She was no longer a child in the eyes of her community. She was a wife, though she did not know what it meant. As the sun dipped low and the voices of children echoed faintly outside, Mercy's gaze lingered toward them. Their laughter felt distant now, unreachable, a sound from a world that no longer belonged to her. That was the day childhood ended. Marriage did not deliver Mercy into safety, it delivered her into silence. The small wooden home she now lived in felt colder than her family's house, though it had more. Its walls pressed in on her, its shadows longer. Her husband was stern, his touch heavy, his voice demanding. To him, she was not a child, not even a person. She was his property. Months passed, each day blurring into the next, until the whispers began again. This time, they were not about her innocence, but about her pregnancy. The thought alone seemed cruel, impossible. Mercy was 12, her body still fragile, unprepared for the storm it now carried. She did not understand the changes, only the pain, the sickness in the mornings, the ache in her back, the exhaustion that settled into her bones. In those days, women suffered quietly, and Mercy was no exception. She would sit by the window, her hands pressed against her stomach, watching the world outside move on as if nothing had changed. Children still played in the fields, their laughter rising into the air, but Mercy was no longer one of them. She sat in silence, her pale face framed by the window, her future narrowing with each passing day. Her mother visited once, her face lined with sorrow and shame. She told Mercy to be strong, to endure, to accept her role. But how could a child accept what she did not even understand? Mercy asked no questions. She knew they would not be answered. She carried the weight alone, her fragile body bearing not just the child within, but the crushing burden of a society that had already abandoned her. The pregnancy advanced with difficulty. Each month brought more pain, more exhaustion. Every step was heavy, every breath a struggle. And yet, no one came to her aid. The community whispered, some with pity, others with disdain, but no one intervened. To them, this was not tragedy. It was simply the way things were. At 12 years old, Mercy Harrow carried more than a child. She carried the weight of silence, the cruelty of tradition, and the indifference of a world that chose to look away. Her womb was too young, but her pain was invisible, and as the months dragged on, her tragedy deepened, preparing to carve its place in history. Mercy's new life unfolded in shadows. The house she was forced to call home stood on the edge of town, surrounded by fields that seemed endless, their silence pressing in on her. By daylight it appeared ordinary. Wooden walls, a sagging roof, the smell of earth and sweat seeping in from the fields. But by night, those walls became a prison, echoing with the footsteps of a man who saw her not as a child, not as a wife, but as possession. Inside, Mercy tried to cling to fragments of herself. She would trace the cracks in the wooden floorboards, pretending they were rivers and roads leading her somewhere else, somewhere far away. She hummed lullabies she once heard her mother sing, though the sound was faint, often drowned by the heavy silence that filled the rooms. Her husband was stern, unyielding. He did not speak much to her, except in commands. His presence was suffocating, his expectations relentless. Mercy, at 12, could not comprehend what it meant to be married, and yet her life was now dictated by the rituals of a role she never chose. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. Her body, still frail from youth, struggled with the changes forced upon it. The early signs of pregnancy came swiftly, waves of nausea, dizziness and fatigue that made even the smallest tasks unbearable. She would sit near the window, pale and weak, her small hands cradling her stomach, wondering if the pain was punishment for something she did not understand. The townsfolk whispered. Some looked at her with pity, others with indifference, but no one intervened. In their eyes, she was simply fulfilling her duty, becoming what society expected of her. Few questioned the morality, fewer still spoke aloud of her suffering. Mercy's cries, silent as they were, went unheard. Her loneliness was absolute. She had no companions, no one to confide in. The doll she once carried was gone, replaced by a ring and responsibilities that weighed her down like chains. Nights were the worst, long stretches of darkness broken only by the sound of her shallow breathing and the occasional creak of floorboards. She would close her eyes and try to imagine she was elsewhere, but the walls always pressed back in, pulling her into reality. Mercy's suffering was not marked by loud moments of cruelty, but by a silence that consumed her, a silence that made her tragedy invisible. And it was in this silence that her spirit began to wither, her body too fragile to bear what was to come, her soul too young to comprehend why it had been chosen for such torment. Pregnancy was a word Mercy had heard whispered, but it was not something she truly understood. For her, the reality was pain. Pain in her back, in her stomach, in her bones. Pain that grew heavier with each passing day. She was 12 years old, her body not yet matured, unprepared to carry life within it. Yet the expectation was clear. She must endure, she must bring forth a child, because that was what wives were meant to do. Her days blurred together. Mornings began with sickness so violent it left her gasping for breath. She would clutch the edge of the wooden table, trying to steady herself as waves of nausea overtook her. The simplest tasks, fetching water, sweeping the floor, carrying firewood, became monumental struggles. Each step was slow, each breath a battle. Her husband did not soften. To him, her weakness was an inconvenience. He expected meals prepared, chores completed, silence maintained. Mercy's complaints were brushed aside, her tears ignored. He did not see her as a child, only as someone bound to him by vows she never understood. Her mother visited on occasion, bringing broth or bread, her eyes heavy with guilt. She would sit by Mercy's side, whispering words of encouragement. "Be strong, this is what women endure." But Mercy was not a woman. She was a child pretending at adulthood, her body crumbling under the weight of expectation. The words meant little. Strength to her was just another burden she could not carry. The community knew. They saw her swollen belly, her fragile frame. Some muttered pity, others scorn. To them she was a child bride, but not a victim. She was part of a cycle, a tradition long accepted. Interference was rare. After all, what was happening to her had happened to countless others before. But Mercy's suffering was her own, unique in its isolation. She had no friends, no confidants. The girls her age were still playing in the fields, still laughing freely. Mercy would sometimes watch them from a distance, her eyes lingering, her heart aching. She wanted to run to them, to join their games, to feel free for even a moment. But her body was heavy, her movement slow, and her place was inside, hidden away. The nights grew longer, the pains sharper. Sometimes she would cry quietly, muffling her sobs in the blanket so no one would hear. She prayed for relief, for some sign that her suffering would end. But the prayers went unanswered. The pain was constant, the expectation unwavering. She was to deliver a child, no matter the cost. In those months, Mercy Harrow became a symbol not of innocence, but of endurance. She bore not just the weight of a life inside her, but the crushing expectation of a society that demanded her silence, her submission, her sacrifice. And though her body weakened with each passing day, the world around her carried on, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding within her small, fragile frame. By the time her pregnancy reached its final months, Mercy was unrecognizable. The lively child who once played by the stream had faded into a pale, hollow figure. Her skin was stretched thin, her eyes dark and sunken. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if the weight she carried might break her at any moment. The pain grew unbearable. Sharp, sudden cramps would seize her body, leaving her doubled over, gasping for air. Her hands trembled constantly, her breath shallow. She could not sleep, her nights consumed by discomfort and fear. She was too young to understand the process, too young to know what awaited her, but she knew, deep inside, that something was terribly wrong. Her husband grew impatient. He did not see suffering, he saw inconvenience. He expected her to remain silent, to endure without complaint. When she faltered, when she failed to complete her chores, his anger simmered, expressed in harsh words, in slammed doors, in the kind of coldness that froze her spirit. Her mother visited more often now, her face pale with worry. She tried to comfort Mercy, holding her hand, brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead. But even she could not hide her fear. She saw what others refused to see. The girl was too young, too fragile. Her body was breaking under the weight of life it could not sustain. When the time came, the labor was excruciating. It began with waves of pain so intense that Mercy cried out, her voice breaking the silence of the small home. Hours passed, each contraction tearing through her, leaving her drenched in sweat, her lips trembling from exhaustion. The midwife, summoned hastily, shook her head, her face grim. She knew the truth. This was not a body ready to give birth. The camera, in this moment, would linger on her face, her eyes wide with terror, her small hands gripping the sheets, her voice calling out in desperation. There was no strength left in her, only a frail hope that somehow she might survive. The labor stretched on, cruel and relentless. Mercy's cries echoed through the night, carrying into the town, but no one came. No one could change what was unfolding. This was her breaking point, the moment when the innocence of a child collided violently with the expectations forced upon her. When the cries finally fell silent, when exhaustion overtook her, the room was filled not with relief, but with an unbearable heaviness. For Mercy Harrow, the tragedy had reached its cruelest chapter. Her body was too young, her spirit too fragile, and as the night gave way to dawn, her story was no longer just her own. It had become a haunting reminder of what happens when innocence is sacrificed at the altar of tradition. The night Mercy's labor began, the world outside seemed indifferent. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the fields, while the town lay silent in its slumber. But inside the small wooden house at the edge of that silence, Mercy was caught in a storm that would decide her fate. Her body writhed with pain, contractions tearing through her with violent force. She was 12, still more child than woman, her frame too fragile for the weight of childbirth. The midwife, summoned in haste, worked tirelessly by candlelight, her eyes shadowed with fear. She had seen many births, but this was different. Mercy's small body trembled, her breath shallow, her voice breaking into cries that echoed through the thin walls. Her husband paced impatiently in the other room, his footsteps heavy against the creaking floorboards. He was not concerned for her suffering, only for the outcome. A child, an heir, a mark of legacy. His muttered words seeped through the doorway, cold and detached, as if her life were of little value compared to what she might deliver. The hours dragged mercilessly. Sweat soaked Mercy's brow as she clutched the sheets, her knuckles white, her cries growing hoarse. Each push left her weaker, each contraction like a blade slicing through her small body. The midwife whispered encouragement, but her voice trembled, betraying the dread she carried. She knew what was happening. This was a body too young, too unprepared. The child inside her was not simply testing her strength, it was tearing it apart. Her mother arrived, breathless, her face pale as she rushed to her daughter's side. She took Mercy's hand, whispering prayers, her tears falling onto the bed, but even she could not mask her fear. The sight of her child, barely more than a girl, writhing in agony was too much to bear. She stroked her hair, whispered, "Hold on, my Mercy, hold on." Though deep down, she wondered if holding on was even possible. The night was long, unforgiving. With every passing hour, Mercy slipped further from herself, her voice fading, her strength unraveling. At moments, her eyes would flutter shut, her breath shallow, her spirit seeming to drift away, only to be pulled back by another violent wave of pain. When the first cry of the baby finally pierced the silence, it was not a sound of relief. It was a haunting echo in a room drenched in sorrow. Mercy's body collapsed, drained beyond measure. She was too weak to hold her child, too broken to celebrate the life she had brought forth. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a battle she seemed destined to lose. The midwife handed the baby to the grandmother, her eyes avoiding Mercy's. The child lived, but the child mother, lay pale and fragile, clinging to life by a thread, and in that moment it became clear. This was not the beginning of a new chapter. This was the unfolding of a tragedy that would scar the town forever. Mercy hovered in a space between life and death. Her body was drained, her spirit tethered only by the faint rhythm of her breath. The baby's cries echoed through the small house, but she could not bring herself to respond. She was too weak, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness, lost in a fog of pain and exhaustion. The midwife worked tirelessly to stop the bleeding, her hands stained, her face tight with grim determination. But with each hour, Mercy grew paler, her skin clammy, her lips dry. She was slipping away, and everyone in the room knew it. Her mother sat at her bedside, holding her hand, whispering prayers with each shallow breath Mercy took. She begged her daughter to fight, to live, though part of her heart ached with guilt. She had agreed to this marriage, had stood silent when Mercy's life was signed away. Now, watching her child suffer, that silence felt like betrayal carved into her soul. Her husband remained in the other room, restless and impatient. He asked after the child, never after Mercy. To him, the survival of the baby was the victory. Mercy's survival was secondary. He saw her as fragile, replaceable. His lack of concern cut deeper than any pain Mercy endured, though she was too weak to express it. As dawn broke, light filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting pale stripes across her face. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, catching the faint glow. In that moment she whispered a name, soft, barely audible, the name she wanted for the child she could not hold. Her mother leaned closer, catching the sound, clutching it like a sacred gift. It was Mercy's only act of ownership, the only decision she was allowed in a life dictated by others. Her breathing grew slower, her chest rising and falling unevenly. The midwife shook her head, her eyes heavy with sorrow. There was nothing left to do but wait, to wait and see whether the fragile thread that bound Mercy to this world would snap or hold. Hours passed. The baby cried, fed and slept, its small presence a contrast to the looming shadow of death. Mercy lingered, neither leaving nor fully returning, caught in a liminal space where time seemed meaningless. To those who watched, it felt as though her soul was deciding, weighing whether to stay or let go. The silence was heavy, broken only by the child's faint whimpers and the whispered prayers of a mother who knew she might soon bury her daughter. Mercy Harrow was only 12, and as she lay between life and death, her story became more than personal tragedy. It became a haunting symbol of innocence sacrificed, of tradition carried too far, of a society blind to the suffering it created. The baby was small, fragile, its cries piercing the quiet of the house. Wrapped in a thin blanket, it squirmed in its grandmother's arms, unaware of the sorrow surrounding its birth. The child represented survival to some, but to Mercy it was a reminder of the suffering she endured, the price she had paid. She could not hold it, could not cradle it, her strength drained beyond repair. Days passed and Mercy lingered, her body refusing to heal. The midwife came and went, her face always grim, never offering false hope. The community whispered, some spoke of the miracle of new life, others of the tragedy of a girl too young to be a mother. Yet none intervened, none sought justice or questioned the cruelty that had led here. To them, this was life as it had always been. Her husband showed little interest in the child beyond its existence. He looked upon it as proof of his manhood, his legacy secured. Mercy's suffering meant nothing to him. He spoke little, his presence cold, his touch absent. The baby cried often, its wails echoing in the small house, but he rarely lifted it. The burden fell on the grandmother, who rocked it to sleep while her heart ached for the daughter she was losing. Mercy watched in silence. Her eyes followed the child as it squirmed, as it cried, as it breathed. Somewhere deep within, she felt the pull of motherhood, the instinct to reach out, to protect, to love. But her body betrayed her, too weak to move, too frail to nurture. Her soul, weighed down by pain, could only whisper silent prayers for the tiny life she had brought forth. The townsfolk visited, offering murmured congratulations, their smiles awkward, their eyes darting to Mercy's pale form on the bed. They congratulated the husband, praised the child, and then left, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Mercy's suffering was invisible to them, overshadowed by the present soul of new life. The baby grew stronger each day, but Mercy did not. Her breaths remained shallow, her body thin and trembling. She existed in the shadow of her own creation, a mother in name only, unable to give the love she carried in her heart. And in that cruel irony, the child became a symbol, not of joy, but of sacrifice. It had taken her childhood, her body, and soon it would take her life. Mercy Harrow's child would grow, but it would do so without the one person who had paid the ultimate price for its existence. Mercy's final days were marked by silence. She no longer cried out in pain, no longer asked for relief. Her body was too weak, her voice too faint. She lay in her bed, her eyes half closed, her breath uneven. The world around her moved on. Her husband worked the fields, the town bustled with its daily life. But inside that small house, time stood still. Her mother stayed by her side, refusing to leave. She held Mercy's hand, whispered prayers, brushed strands of hair from her face. She knew the end was near. Each breath Mercy took felt borrowed, each moment fragile and fleeting. The baby cried often, its small voice cutting through the silence. Mercy would turn her head slightly, her eyes softening as she watched. She could not hold the child, but she could see it, could hear it, could love it from afar. She whispered the name she had chosen, her lips forming the sound even when her voice failed. It was her gift, her legacy, the only piece of herself she could leave behind. Her husband rarely entered the room. When he did, it was brief, his presence cold and distant. He did not speak to Mercy, did not acknowledge her suffering. To him she was fading, and her importance had already diminished. The child was what mattered now, not the fragile girl who had given everything to bring it into the world. On the final night, the room was quiet, lit only by a flickering candle. Mercy's breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. Her mother held her hand, tears streaming down her face, whispering words of comfort. The midwife stood nearby, silent, knowing there was nothing left to do. Mercy's eyes opened one last time, glistening in the candlelight. She looked at her child, then at her mother, and a faint smile crossed her lips. It was a smile not of joy, but of release, a quiet surrender to the inevitable. She exhaled slowly, her body relaxing, her head and going limp in her mother's grasp. The candle flickered, the room fell silent. Mercy Harrow, 12 years old, bride, mother and victim, had taken her final breath. The baby cried in the silence, a haunting reminder of the life that had cost another. The grandmother wept softly, holding her daughter's hand, her grief filling the small house. Outside, the world carried on, indifferent to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Mercy's story ended that night, but her tragedy did not. It lingered in the whispers of the town, in the cries of the child, in the silence of a society that had allowed innocence to be stolen, sacrificed at the altar of survival and tradition. And though she was gone, her name would echo as a haunting reminder. Mercy Harrow, married and pregnant at 12, lost to a world that failed her. Deep within the heart of the Ashford estate stood a structure long forgotten by time, a chapel whose walls bore the weight of centuries. Unlike the grandeur of the main manor, the chapel was a hidden ruin, cloaked in ivy and shadow, its spire broken and leaning as though bowing to forces unseen. For decades, villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices trembling whenever the topic arose. It was not simply an abandoned church. It was a place where the boundary between the sacred and the profane had been violently torn apart. Those who dared approach the chapel at night often claimed to hear voices drifting from within, not the solemn chants of prayer, but broken whispers that wove through the air like the hiss of serpents. They swore the words were not in English nor in any language they could recognize, yet the meaning pressed against their minds with an unbearable weight. Pleas for release, cries for vengeance, and the mocking laughter of something that no longer belonged to this world. Local folklore suggested that the Ashford family had once used the chapel not for worship, but for something much darker. Some claimed it had been consecrated to a deity of their own making, a patron of power and blood, whose favor they desperately sought. Others believed that beneath the cracked altar lay bones, not of saints, but of sacrifices, bodies buried hastily to keep the truth from spreading. No historian could ever verify these claims, for every attempt to investigate the chapel ended in disaster. Scholars who entered never returned the same. Some emerged silent and pale, their hair streaked white as if aged decades overnight. Others vanished entirely, swallowed by the stone moor of the chapel, their absence explained away as foolish accidents. But the whispers grew bolder over the years. Villagers living closest to the estate claimed that when the wind was still, they could hear the chapel's choir of the damned echoing across the fields. Children woke screaming, describing figures in tattered robes standing at their windows, faces hidden behind cracked porcelain masks. Livestock was found drained of blood, their carcasses carefully arranged in patterns that resembled crosses turned upside down. The fear spread like a sickness, weaving itself into the very identity of the region. Yet the Ashfords themselves rarely acknowledged the chapel. To them, it was a relic best forgotten, a scar of their ancestry they wished to bury under silence. But silence does not erase corruption. It festers, it waits. And as generations passed, the chapel's whispers became louder, bolder, as if sensing the weakness in the family line. The villagers warned newcomers never to step near the crumbling doorway, for once the chapel had your name, they said, it would never let you go. The most chilling account came from a groundskeeper named Elias, who had worked the estate in the late 1800s. He confessed before his death that one evening, while clearing fallen branches, he heard organ music drifting from the chapel. Against his better judgment, he followed the sound, curiosity gnawing at him like hunger. When he entered, the pews were filled, not with people but with shadows. They sat rigid and silent, yet he felt dozens of eyes upon him. The organ played itself, keys pressing down as if moved by invisible hands. Elias swore that when he fled, he felt cold fingers clutching at his ankles, pulling, dragging, as if the congregation had decided to welcome him into their fold. He never returned to the chapel again, and even on his deathbed he wept as he warned others to stay away. "It is not empty," he whispered. "It has never been empty." The whispers of the forgotten chapel linger to this day. Tourists and thrill-seekers who trespass upon the ruins often leave with nightmares that gnaw at their sanity. They describe the sensation of being watched, of hearing prayers spoken backward, of seeing the cracked stained glass bleed crimson under moonlight. The Ashford family's story was not simply one of wealth and influence. It was a story stained with blood, bound by a curse that seemed to echo through each generation. From the outside, they appeared like any aristocratic lineage: lavish estates, inherited titles, portraits painted to immortalize their faces in gilded frames. But beneath the polished veneer lay a thread of darkness, woven so tightly into their bloodline that no member could ever escape it. The curse, as the villagers called it, was not marked by sudden tragedy or misfortune alone. It was patient, deliberate, choosing its victims with care. Some Ashfords were driven to madness, their minds unraveling in whispers only they could hear. Others met violent ends, suicides that seemed more like sacrifices, accidents too strange to be coincidence. A few lived long lives, but even they were haunted by visions and shadows that followed them until their final breath. Legends claim the curse began with Alaric Ashford, the patriarch who first constructed the manor in the 1600s. Obsessed with power, he was rumored to have struck a bargain with forces not of this world, offering devotion in exchange for prosperity. While the Ashford estate flourished, the family tree withered, children were stillborn, heirs grew ill, and siblings turned upon one another in bitter feuds that ended in bloodshed, yet the wealth remained, as though the curse demanded blood as payment for gold. In every generation, there was one child marked by the curse more strongly than the others. They were often gifted, brilliant, talented, or unusually charismatic, but as they matured, they fell into ruin, consumed by darkness. Some were artists who painted visions too grotesque for human eyes, others scholars who vanished into occult studies, their journals filled with impossible symbols and warnings written in a trembling hand. Perhaps the most infamous was Evelyn Ashford, born in 1792. Known for her beauty and charm, she was admired by all who met her. Yet behind closed doors, Evelyn claimed she was plagued by voices. She insisted that ancestors she had never met spoke to her, demanding she continue their work. Servants reported finding her in the chapel at night, dressed in burial shrouds, whispering prayers in a language they did not understand. Evelyn's end came when she leapt from the manor's balcony on her 33rd birthday. Witnesses swore they saw unseen hands shove her into the air. Her body was found twisted upon the stones below, her face frozen in an expression of both terror and ecstasy. Evelyn's story was not unique. Nearly every generation had its Evelyn, an Ashford who embodied the family's brilliance before descending into madness or meeting a gruesome fate. Each one added weight to the villagers' certainty. The curse was real, and it would never let the Ashfords go. Even those who rejected superstition could not ignore the pattern. Records show a startling number of Ashford deaths marked by violence or despair. Fires claimed bedrooms without spreading to the rest of the house. Heirs drowned in shallow waters where no one else had ever struggled. And always in the background, the chapel loomed, a silent witness to every tragedy. What made the curse most terrifying was its refusal to die. Unlike ordinary misfortune, it seemed to grow stronger with each victim, as though feeding upon their suffering. By the 19th century, whispers spread beyond the village. Travelers and scholars from distant lands came to study the Ashfords, treating them like a living case study of generational damnation. But most who investigated found themselves ensnared. Strange illnesses followed them home. Their research disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some even perished, as though the curse punished not only the family but anyone who dared to expose its secrets. The Ashford family had many servants over the centuries, but one figure in particular stands out in their history, a figure whose loyalty blurred into something far more disturbing. Known only as the Keeper, this individual's name has been lost to time, yet their presence remains etched in the estate's darkest tales. Unlike the fleeting staff who came and went, the Keeper endured. Generations passed, yet villagers swore the same gaunt figure remained at the manor, unchanged by age. Tall and skeletal, always clad in black, the Keeper was less a servant and more a shadow tethered to the Ashfords. His duties went beyond the ordinary. He was not seen cleaning nor tending to the grounds. Instead, he kept the records, the journals, the letters, the artifacts that carried the weight of the family's history. It was said that within the manor's east wing, hidden behind locked doors, the keeper maintained a library unlike any other. Not of literature or art, but of secrets, volumes bound in strange leather, ledgers detailing sacrifices and pacts, diaries that chronicled madness in meticulous detail. The keeper guarded them all, ensuring that no knowledge ever escaped the Ashfords' grasp. Some whispered that the keeper was not human at all, but something summoned long ago to serve as the family's archivist. He appeared when needed, vanished when ignored, and always seemed to know more than he should, his eyes deep-set and unblinking, unsettled even the Ashfords themselves. Children of the family were warned never to look into his gaze for too long, lest they see reflections not of themselves, but of their inevitable fate. Rumors grew that the keeper was the one who maintained the curse, feeding it with his careful preservation of history. He was the bridge between generations, ensuring that the sins of the past never faded, that the whispers of ancestors continued to haunt their descendants. Villagers believed that without him the curse might wither and die, but as long as he remained, the Ashfords would never be free. On rare occasions, outsiders claimed to have glimpsed him. Travelers passing the estate late at night saw a lantern glow moving through the windows, carried by a silhouette too thin to be natural. One man described seeing the keeper in the chapel, kneeling at the altar with his hands pressed against the stone as if listening to voices from beneath. When the man blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint smell of burnt wax in the air. Yet despite the fear he inspired, there were those within the family who clung to the keeper. He was, after all, their link to the past, their guide through the shadows they could not escape. Some heirs confided in him more than in their own kin, pouring secrets into his ever-listening silence. It was said that he never spoke more than a few words, but when he did, his voice was dry and hollow, like parchment crumbling into dust. His advice always carried a weight that felt less like guidance and more like prophecy. When the estate finally fell into ruin, the keeper vanished. No record of his fate exists, no grave, no obituary. Some claim he simply walked into the chapel one night and never emerged, his duty complete. Others insist he still wanders the ruins, lantern in hand, searching for someone new to inherit his burden. And there are those who whisper that every now and then, beneath the hollow windows of the manor, a light flickers, a reminder that the secrets of the Ashfords are never truly lost. The keeper remains one of the great mysteries of the Ashford saga. Was he a man, cursed to eternal servitude, a spirit bound by pact, or perhaps the curse itself, given form and flesh to ensure its survival? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: without the keeper, the Ashfor, his story would have faded. But with him, it endures, a chilling testament to how some secrets are too heavy to bury, too dark to forget, and too dangerous to remember. The Ashford family name had long been associated with power, wealth, and aristocratic prestige, but beneath the surface of their grandeur was a haunting shadow that never seemed to fade. For generations, whispers of a curse followed them wherever they went. Tragedies, mysterious deaths, and unexplained madness seemed to mark their bloodline as doomed. By the mid-19th century, the legend of the Ashford curse had grown into something much larger than gossip. Locals claimed that anyone who crossed the family or married into it would meet a grisly fate. Others swore the family had dabbled in occult practices, sealing their wealth with rituals that bound their descendants to darkness. The supposed curse first became prominent when Eliza Ashford, a young bride of the family, was found lifeless in her bed just weeks after her wedding. There were no signs of illness, no clear explanation. Her face, some said, was frozen in terror, her eyes wide as though she had seen something unspeakable in her final moments. Soon after, 2 of her children died under equally strange circumstances, fueling rumors that the family had been marked by something unnatural. With each passing generation, the stories multiplied. A patriarch fell from a horse in broad daylight, his neck snapping instantly, though the horse had not bolted, and no one could explain why he had been thrown. Another member drowned in the estate's reflecting pool, though the water was shallow, and the man had been an excellent swimmer. The deaths piled one upon another, each more mysterious than the last, and the villagers began to speak of the Ashfords not with envy, but with dread. It wasn't just death that seemed to stalk the family. Madness, too, crept in like an inherited disease. Several Ashford heirs were said to suffer from violent delusions and uncontrollable fits of rage. They were locked away in hidden rooms of the manor, their existence hushed up and their names struck from family records. Servants spoke of the chilling sounds that echoed through the halls at night, screams, wails, and the pounding of fists against stone walls. The Ashford estate itself became a character in the story of this supposed curse. Its halls grew darker with every passing tragedy, its windows like black eyes staring out at the world with menace. Local clergy tried to bless the grounds, but their prayers seemed to do little. One priest was found dead on the church steps only days after attempting to exorcise the manor. His body, some said, bore strange markings, as though carved by invisible hands. Whether by coincidence or by some darker design, the family's attempts to escape their fate always ended in ruin. Those who left the estate and sought new lives abroad often met strange deaths in foreign lands. Letters sent back to England described visions, hauntings, and relentless misfortune. One Ashford daughter, who had married into a wealthy American family, reportedly threw herself from the roof of her husband's home, leaving behind a journal filled with frantic notes about shadows that followed her across the ocean. As the stories grew, the townsfolk began to avoid the Ashfords altogether. Children were warned not to stray near the estate, lest the curse reach beyond the bloodline. Weddings with Ashford heirs were met with quiet resistance. Families whispered of their daughters' lives being forfeited if they ever became Ashford brides. The once proud lineage, rather than admired, was feared as a house of death. But what truly cemented the idea of the curse was the Ashfords' own behavior. Instead of publicly denying the rumors, the family retreated further into secrecy. They barred the estate's gates, dismissed staff at the slightest hint of disloyalty, and covered their mirrors in black clot, H during times of mourning. Servants who dared speak out claimed the family had a secret chamber in the manor where rituals were conducted, with blood sacrifices offered to keep their fortune intact. The Ashford Manor was no ordinary estate. It was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors, hidden rooms, and staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. For centuries, it had stood as the family's fortress, a symbol of their wealth and power. But to those who lived within its walls, it was something much darker. The manor whispered, groaned, and breathed with an unsettling life of its own. Servants often spoke of voices in the night, faint murmurs that seemed to drift through the walls. At first, they dismissed them as tricks of the wind or the creaks of old timber, but the voices became too distinct to ignore. They were hushed conversations in languages no one recognized, laughter that turned to screams, and chants that rose and fell like the rhythm of a heartbeat. More than one servant abandoned their post after only a few weeks, unable to endure the constant sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The upper floors of the manor were particularly feared. Entire wings were sealed off after a series of unexplained incidents. Candles would not stay lit, doors slammed shut on their own, and mirrors cracked without cause. The Ashfords themselves rarely ventured into these abandoned halls, leaving them to gather dust and decay. Yet even in neglect, these rooms carried an eerie presence. Guests who wandered too far from the main chambers often reported cold drafts, sudden nausea, or the sensation of invisible hands brushing against their skin. What unsettled the staff most, however, were the strange noises that came from behind the walls. Scratching, dragging, and tapping echoed through the manor at all hours. At times it sounded as though something, or someone, was crawling within the structure itself. Workers tasked with repairs refused to enter the crawl spaces, claiming they saw shapes moving in the dark, shapes too large to be rats. The most disturbing accounts came from those walled in, who slept within the manor. Nightmares plagued them with such intensity that sleep became nearly impossible. Dreams of being buried alive, of choking on ash, of pale figures standing at the foot of their beds were reported again and again. One maid awoke to find long scratches down her arms, though she swore she had not touched anything in her sleep. Another claimed she woke to see a man in Victorian garb staring down at her, his face half rotted, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Some believed the whispers were the voices of the Ashfords' lost souls, family members who had died under violent or suspicious circumstances, their spirits trapped within the walls of their ancestral home. Others thought the manor itself had become a vessel of evil, absorbing the suffering of generations until it grew sentient. Whatever the truth, the manor's whispers were relentless. They grew louder during storms, when thunder shook the foundations and lightning illuminated the estate's twisted silhouette against the sky. During these nights, the voices seemed to multiply, filling the air with chanting and screams, until even the bravest servants fled to the stables rather than remain inside. Despite the growing fear, the Ashford family never abandoned their estate. It was as if they were bound to it, unable to leave the place that had both sustained and destroyed them. They endured the whispers, the hauntings, and the strange occurrences with a stoic silence that only deepened the aura of dread surrounding their name. But silence did not erase the truth. The whispers in the walls were real, and they carried with them the weight of centuries of secrets that the family would go to great lengths to protect. By the late 1800s, the Ashford family was no longer a dynasty of admired aristocrats, but a crumbling house trapped in the shadow of its own reputation. The curse, the whispers, and the mounting tragedies had taken their toll. Each new generation seemed weaker, more fragile, and more susceptible to the darkness that clung to the family name. Where once there had been wealth and splendor, there was now decay. The estate's grandeur faded, its gardens overrun with weeds, its walls damp with mold. The family's fortune dwindled, squandered by heirs too unstable or too consumed by paranoia to manage it wisely. Scandals erupted. Duels, affairs, and public outbursts of violence became common, tarnishing what little dignity the Ashfords had left. The descent was not only financial but psychological. Madness ran through the bloodline like a plague, infecting sons and daughters alike. One heir was rumored to have murdered his own brother in a fit of jealousy, claiming that the whispers told him to. Another kept journals filled with frantic writings about shadows crawling beneath his skin. The town, once intimidated by the Ashfords' power, now regarded them as both a curiosity and a warning. Parents told their children never to marry into the family, lest the curse spread. The estate became a local legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones around taverns and church pews. Travelers passed it quickly, averting their eyes from its looming silhouette. The Ashfords themselves grew increasingly isolated. Rarely did they attend public functions, and when they did, their presence was unsettling. Their pallid skin, sunken eyes, and erratic behavior only reinforced the belief that they were no longer entirely human. Servants whispered that they heard arguments between family members who weren't there, as though the Ashfords conversed with invisible companions. By the end of the century, Rye, the once great family, was a shadow of its former self. A handful of heirs remained, but they lived like prisoners within their own walls, consumed by paranoia, guilt, and a lingering sense that they were being watched, not just by the townsfolk, but by something far older and far darker. The Ashfords had descended fully into darkness, and the world, watching from a distance, wondered how much further they could fall before the family's name was finally erased from history. The Ashford Manor had always been more than just a house. It was a monument to the family's ambition, wealth, and secrets. By the late 19th century, its corridors had become synonymous with unease. Guests often described an atmosphere that seemed to weigh down upon them, as though invisible eyes followed their every step. The manor's lavish ballrooms and richly decorated halls might have dazzled during social gatherings, but when silence reclaimed them, the house revealed its darker nature. The walls, it was said, carried whispers, not merely echoes of sound, but something deeper, like fragments of sorrow trapped within the stone. Servants, those who stayed long enough to endure its oppressive presence, claimed they would hear faint voices at night, drifting through the corridors. They described them as whispers of children crying, women weeping, and men muttering indistinct words like prayers that would never reach heaven. It was as though the house itself had become a diary, recording every act of cruelty, every broken promise, every scream that had once filled its rooms. One chamber in particular earned a chilling reputation, the East Wing Nursery. Though no child had lived in the manor for decades, visitors swore they heard the unmistakable sound of laughter, followed by the pitter-patter of small feet across the wooden floorboards. Some who dared to stay overnight reported waking to see the faint outline of a child at the foot of their bed, only for the vision to vanish the moment they blinked. But what unsettled people the most was not the apparitions or the sounds, but the sense of being absorbed into something larger, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, listening, hungering. Architects brought in to repair parts of the structure spoke of an odd vibration in the walls, as though the foundation carried more than just weight. They described it as the yun, settling hum of a place that had witnessed too much, one that could not rid itself of memory. The Ashford family themselves seemed to acknowledge this silent presence, though never openly. Diaries from distant cousins who visited the estate mention the unspoken rule, never wander alone after dark. It was not out of fear of burglars or missteps, but of the manor itself. The house claims the careless, one cousin wrote. It knows who belongs within its walls, and it resents outsiders. Over time, the whispers became part of the law. Travellers passing through the region would exchange tales of Ashford Manor, treating it as both marvel and warning. Some believed the family had made a pact long ago, offering the manor as a vessel to hold the sins they could not confess. Others thought the structure absorbed energy like a sponge, its walls darkened not by smoke or age, but by despair. Whatever the truth, those who left the manor never forgot its whispers. Some spoke of them years later, their voices trembling as though the sound still echoed in their ears. And for the Ashfords themselves, living amid those walls was a sentence, a reminder that the past could not be buried, only contained. Ashford Manor stood not as a home, but as a prison of memories, and the whispers were the guards, ensuring that no one inside ever truly found peace. Among the many tragedies that befell the Ashford family, none sent greater ripples of fear through the manor than the disappearance of Eleanor Ashford. She was the youngest daughter of the second generation, a spirited girl who seemed untouched by the gloom that shadowed her lineage. Her laughter was said to brighten even the darkest halls, her presence a fleeting glimpse of innocence amid the growing darkness of the estate. It was a cold autumn night when Eleanor vanished. The manor was hosting one of its grand masquerade balls, with lords, ladies, and dignitaries in attendance. The ballroom glittered with candlelight, masks shimmered in the glow, and music echoed through the house like a heartbeat. Eleanor, dressed in a gown of pale blue satin, was last seen dancing near the grand staircase. Several guests recalled her laughter, a sound both sweet and fleeting. And then, she was gone. At first her absence was dismissed as a child's wanderlust. The manor was vast, and it wasn't unusual for Eleanor to slip away from the noise and hide among the hidden passageways she adored exploring. Servants and guests began searching, calling her name, their voices echoing against stone walls. Hours passed, and unease spread like wildfire. The search extended into the gardens, the stables, even the nearby woods. But Eleanor Ashford had vanished as though swallowed whole. Panic turned to dread when her pale blue satin slipper was found at the threshold of the east wing, the same wing where whispers and shadows had plagued the family for years. Some believed she had been lured into that wing, claimed by whatever haunted the rooms. Others whispered of something darker, that Eleanor was offered as a sacrifice to appease the restless spirits dwelling within the manor. Her mother collapsed into grief, her cries echoing through the manor for months. Her father grew silent, retreating into his study, emerging only to curse the estate and its cursed legacy. Servants left in droves, convinced they had witnessed the house consume an innocent soul. No body was ever found, no trace of Eleanor beyond that single slipper. For decades her name lingered in hushed tones spoken with both reverence and terror. Visitors to the manor claimed they sometimes saw her figure near the grand staircase, a flicker of blue silk drifting past their eyes. Others heard her laughter, faint and distant, carried by unseen winds through the halls. Legends grew. Some said Eleanor's spirit became bound to the manor, trapped forever in the corridors she once explored with joy. Others believed she had been hidden away by the family, concealed for reasons too shameful to reveal. The truth, whether supernatural or human, remained buried beneath silence. But one detail lingered, passed down through whispers of servants who had been there that night. The slipper, when first found, was warm to the touch, as though Eleanor had just stepped out of it. And in the hours that followed before dawn broke, several guests swore they heard a child's voice, faint yet clear, calling from the east wing, "Please, help me." For generations, the Ashfords carried themselves with pride, their lineage steeped in wealth and reputation, but beneath their polished veneer, whispers of a curse clung to the family name. Misfortune seemed to follow them like a shadow, striking each generation with uncanny precision. Children died young, marriages collapsed into scandal, and madness claimed more than a few. The origins of the supposed curse remain shrouded in mystery. Some traced it back to the manor's construction, claiming the Ashfords built their fortune on blood and betrayal. Rumors spread of cheated business partners, workers buried in collapsed foundations, and even whispered deals with dark forces. Others believed the curse was self-inflicted, the family's endless pursuit of power breeding consequences no one could escape. The pattern was unmistakable. Sons grew into cruel men, their temperaments marred by violence or obsession. Daughters, often innocent and bright in childhood, faded into despair or vanished under mysterious circumstances. Few lived long lives, and those who did carried the burden of tragedy upon their shoulders. Local villagers spoke of the family as both envied and pitied. The Ashfords, one farmer said, have everything but peace. Their wealth bought them status, but it could not shield them from the cycle of ruin. Even those who married into the family seemed to succumb, as though the curse recognized blood by choice as well as birth. Perhaps most chilling was the similarity in their fates. Deaths often came in threes. An elder struck by sudden illness, a younger sibling lost to accident, and another driven into madness. The cycle repeated, generation after generation, until it became impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. What made the curse all the more terrifying was its subtlety. It did not always strike immediately, nor with obvious force. Instead, it eroded the family from within, unraveling bonds, feeding paranoia, and twisting love into resentment. Parents feared for their children, siblings turned against one another, and trust became an impossible luxury. The Ashfords, proud though they were, began to acknowledge the curse in private. Diaries revealed prayers for protection, talismans hidden in rooms, and desperate letters to priests and mystics alike. None of it worked. The curse, if it truly existed, had no interest in bargains. It simply fed on the family's sins, growing stronger with every generation. By the turn of the century, the name Ashford no longer commanded admiration. It inspired fear. Locals avoided the manor, and children told ghost stories of the cursed bloodline. Even those who knew nothing of Eleanor's disappearance or the whispers of the manor could sense the weight of something unnatural. For the Ashfords, there was no escaping it. Their wealth rotted alongside their souls, and though they built walls to keep the world out, the curse seeped through every stone, every breath. The bloodline was not just marked, it was doomed. The Ashfords loved their grandeur, and despite the tragedies, they continued to host lavish gatherings in the manor. But none would be remembered more than the final gala, a night of opulence that descended into terror, forever sealing the family's legacy in infamy. It was winter, the manor ablaze with candlelight as guests arrived in carriages, their laughter rising into the cold night air. Inside, the ballroom glittered, chandeliers casting golden light across masks, gowns, and jewels. The Ashfords spared no expense. Musicians filled the room with haunting melodies, and servants moved swiftly, ensuring glasses never emptied. It was a celebration meant to silence whispers of curses and ghosts, a show of power and endurance. But beneath the beauty of the night, unease lingered. Guests later recalled a tension in the air, like static before a storm. The laughter seemed forced, the music too sharp, and the smiles too wide. The house itself seemed restless, its walls vibrating with a low hum that unnerved even the bravest. At midnight, the celebration reached its height. Fireworks erupted outside, their colors reflecting against frosted windows. Inside, dancers spun in circles of light and shadow. But as the clock struck 12, the chandeliers flickered. For a heartbeat, the entire manor plunged into darkness. Gasps echoed through the ballroom, followed by nervous laughter when the lights returned. Yet something had changed. Several guests noticed empty spaces on the dance floor where people had stood moments before. Names were called, but no answers came. Panic spread as it became clear. People were disappearing, not slipping out through the doors, but vanishing as though swallowed by the manor itself. Screams erupted. Masks were torn away. Gowns ripped as guests fled in terror. Servants dropped trays, their contents shattering on marble floors. The musicians stopped, playing, their instruments abandoned mid-note. Chaos reigned as people rushed for the exits, only to find doors sealed tight, as if the house itself had locked them inside. What happened next remains a subject of speculation. Some claimed the walls seemed to move, narrowing the ballroom into a suffocating space. Others swore they saw figures, shadows of past Ashfords, emerging from corners, pulling the living into darkness. A few survivors, pale and trembling, insisted they heard Eleanor's laughter, mingling with the screams, echoing above the chaos. By dawn, the ballroom was empty. Carriages remained outside, horses restless in the cold, but no one emerged. Servants who had fled before the chaos returned to find the manor silent. Inside, the tables were still set, glasses half filled, and music sheets left scattered across the floor. But of the dozens who had attended, only a handful were ever seen again. The final gala became legend. Some said the manor had claimed what it was owed, feeding on the guests to sustain the curse. Others believed the Ashfords had orchestrated something unspeakable, sealing their fate alongside their victims. Whatever the truth, the gala was the last time the manor opened its doors to society. From that night forward, Ashford Manor stood abandoned, a monument to terror. Its windows dark, its halls empty, except, perhaps, for the whispers of laughter and screams, forever trapped within its walls. The old Ashford estate, once echoing with aristocratic laughter and grandeur, now stood silent, consumed by creeping ivy and the weight of its own sins. But before it slipped into complete ruin, one last figure carried its legacy like a curse, the final heir, a man both fragile and formidable. He was born into whispers, into the shadow of his family's blood-soaked history, and with every step he took through the decaying halls, he felt as though unseen eyes trailed him. Villagers spoke of him with pity, others with fear. They claimed he could hear voices where none existed, see figures in the corner of his eye that vanished when confronted. But whether haunted by ghosts or simply by memory, he embodied the last flickering candle in a house destined for eternal darkness. As he wandered through abandoned chambers, he would pause in rooms where portraits of his ancestors hung, their painted eyes almost alive, following him. Nights were the worst. The manor creaked like an old ship adrift, and footsteps echoed where no one walked. Sometimes he would awaken to the faint cry of a child, or worse, the sound of a lullaby sung by a voice long dead. His journals, recovered years later, revealed a man unraveling. Page after page spoke of guilt, of unseen forces urging him to atone. But how could he atone for sins that were not his own? To the townfolk, he was already cursed. They avoided him, crossing themselves when he passed, and warned their children never to go near the manor. But loneliness is a terrible companion, and in that isolation, his mind frayed further. Some believe he succumbed to madness. Others say he was claimed by the same darkness that swallowed his bloodline. What remains certain is that he died as he lived, alone, in the decaying heart of Ashford Manor, the last heir of a dynasty of horrors. Among the many legends whispered about Ashford Manor, none struck terror quite like the story of the sealed room. Hidden deep within the east wing, this chamber was walled up decades earlier, its door bricked over, its windows shut tight with iron. Rumors swirled that it was not merely closed, it was entombed. Workers who had been ordered to seal it refused to speak of what they saw before the bricks went up, though a few muttered that the stench inside was unbearable, like rot mixed with something far worse. Some said screams were heard even after the final brick was laid. For years, the sealed room remained just that, untouched, avoided, cursed. But temptation is a powerful lure. In the late 1800s, a group of curious men, half drunk on bravado, attempted to break through. They brought tools, hammers, crowbars, determined to uncover the truth. But as the bricks cracked away, an icy wind poured out, though the room was windowless. The stench they described was suffocating, and when their lanterns were raised, shadows seemed to dart across the walls, though the chamber was empty. Only one of them dared step inside, and within moments he let out a shriek that chilled the others to the bone. They dragged him out, but his hair had turned shock white, his skin pale as ash. He never spoke again, never uttered a word of what he saw. Days later, he was found hanging from a tree near the manor grounds. Since then, the sealed room has remained untouched once more, with locals swearing that at night, faint pounding can still be heard from within, as if someone, or something, desperately claws to be let out. The Ashfords were known not only for their cruelty, but for their obsessions. Among them, none was more chilling than the Collector, a distant cousin whose fascination with death grew into something grotesque. His chamber, discovered long after his death, revealed the depths of his madness. Inside were cabinets filled with preserved insects, jars containing strange fluids, and most horrifying of all, relics that could not possibly be explained by natural curiosity. There were small bones, tiny skulls, fragments of human hair sealed within glass. Villagers whispered that he had once lured children from the town, promising sweets and stories, only for them to vanish without trace. The chamber's centerpiece, however, was a grotesque mannequin, a life-size doll dressed in fine lace, its face constructed not of porcelain but stitched together from patches of leather-like skin. Some claimed it was human. The air in the chamber was heavy, almost suffocating, and those who entered reported hearing faint scratching sounds, though no vermin could be found. To this day, no one knows how many lives were lost to the collector's obsession, for the Ashford family covered up his crimes, dismissing them as eccentricities of a wealthy man. But the chamber remains a testament to his sickness, and many believe his spirit lingers, still tending to his collection, still searching for new additions to his cabinet of horrors. Every cursed dynasty has an end, and for the Ashfords it came with fire. Accounts differ on whether the blaze that consumed the manor was an accident or something far more sinister. Some say it was the last heir himself, finally driven mad, who set the torch. Others claim villagers fed up with generations of cruelty surrounded the estate under cover of night and burned it down to erase its presence forever. Whatever the truth, the fire was said to be unnatural. Witnesses described flames rising higher than any blaze should, burning not just wood but stone itself, as though the very earth beneath the manor wished to erase the family's name. Screams echoed across the valley that night, screams that many swore did not belong to the living. Shadows danced within the inferno, faces pressed against broken windows, mouths open in silent agony, but not all of them were human. Some claimed to see figures with elongated limbs, twisted forms writhing in the smoke, and when the fire finally died, the manor was a husk, a skeleton of stone walls blackened by soot. Yet the air lingered heavy with the scent of burning flesh, and no bodies were ever found. Some whispered that the family was claimed by the inferno itself, dragged into a realm of eternal torment. Even now, when the wind blows just right, villagers say you can still hear the faint crackle of flames and the anguished cries of the Ashfords on that final night. Though the manor is nothing more than ruins today, its story refuses to fade. For generations, locals have avoided the land, insisting it is cursed. Travelers who venture too close report strange happenings, cold spots that freeze the skin, whispers that carry on the breeze, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. At night, pale lights flicker in the ruins, as though lanterns move through the halls that no longer exist. Paranormal investigators who dared explore have captured chilling evidence, faint voices calling out names, shadows darting across their cameras, and one recording of a child's laughter that still haunts listeners. But beyond the ghost stories lies something more enduring: the legacy of fear. The Ashfords, once a family of wealth and power, are remembered not for their fortune, but for the darkness they spread. Their sins have become folklore, their names synonymous with horror, and yet people remain drawn to their story, compelled by the mixture of tragedy and terror. Perhaps it is a reminder that no dynasty, no matter how powerful, can escape the weight of its own sins. Or perhaps it is something darker, that the Ashfords are not truly gone, that their echoes still linger, waiting, watching, whispering through time. The ruins stand as a monument, not just to a fallen family, but to the chilling truth that some legacies are too dark to die.